Thank you everyone for joining us today to talk about personnel file audits. I know that is just an extremely exciting topic. Certainly is one that creates a bit of risk, and so I'm excited to be talking with you about some best practices. I am Lori Dahlberg. I am the HR Consulting Senior Manager here at Eide Bailly, and I head up our general HR consulting practice. What I do is I provide services to clients in the areas of HR. So for clients who don't have an HR team and might have a basic question, I'm happy to help them with that. For larger clients that may have bigger HR teams and maybe just don't have the time to get to all of the things that HR is now responsible for, and they might need someone to help them out or bounce something off of, I assist with that as well. One of the primary things I have been doing a lot of this year are personnel file audits and I-9 audits. I have 4 of them going on right now and have another 5 of them scheduled between September and December. So it is definitely a subject matter that people seem to be interested in and actually taking some action towards doing something about. So today I'm going to share some of my best practices, and hopefully you will learn something here that allows you to do a personnel file audit to ensure that your records are compliant and are actually serving the purpose that they are intended to serve. All right, to start things off, it's kind of important to understand why you might need a personnel file audit. The reason that we have it is that employment records are regulated by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They are referred to as the EEOC. And what they are responsible for looking at are all of the records that employers take and maintain for employees. So any information that you gather from an employee, any documentation that you have regarding an employee, that falls underneath the kind of the purview of what they are responsible for enforcing. And there are some best practices and there are some legal regulations that surround these things. And when we're talking about employment records, it includes things like recruitment records. So job postings, any candidate information, resumes, applications, pre-screening that you might do, interview questions or responses, notes that you might take. All of that falls underneath recruitment, and those records that you maintain are regulated by the EEOC. Hiring, so the onboarding and actually getting somebody into your organization after they've gone through the recruitment process, all of the hiring documentation that you gather is considered HR related materials. Same with compensation. That could include any compensation ranges or studies that you might have related to a specific position an employee is part of. It could be pay increases, pay deductions if somebody goes on part-time status and you need to adjust their wage, any deductions that you might take, that is all considered compensation HR records. Anything related to benefits, so enrollments, changes, any use of short-term disability or long-term disability type documents, that falls in there. Performance records, so that could be performance evaluations. It could include performance improvement plans or documentation regarding poor performance or kudos related to good performance that an employee may receive. It also includes medical related information, so leaves of absences, reasonable accommodation, things related to somebody having COVID and needing to be out. It could be doctor's certifications indicating why an employee has missed a day or 2 of work. All of that is considered HR records. Termination documentation, so if you have terminated someone and you have a checklist, or if you have a severance agreement that they have signed or that you issued that they didn't sign, any documentation related to the reason for the termination, that is all considered HR or personnel file information. And basically anything else that you retain or file about an employee, all of that falls underneath the EEOC's regulation. And you want to make sure that you're handling that documentation properly. To start things off, and just to make sure everyone understands what I'm talking about, when I am referring to HR during our presentation, I'm referring to the person within your organization who handles human resources or who at least maintains those employee records that we're going to be talking about. In larger organizations, you may have an HR department, and so therefore HR is pretty commonplace with regards to the terminology. But for smaller organizations, you may have designated an individual who has other job responsibilities beyond HR, and they are tasked with maintaining employee files or handling HR. That is who I am referring to whenever I mention HR in this presentation. So even if you don't have an HR department, I'm talking about whoever it is that handles the maintenance or the filing of your employee records. We are going to start with our first poll here, just so that I can get a sense of where you guys are at with regards to how you file your employee documentation. So the question is, do you keep your employee documents in one personnel file, whether that's a paper copy file or an electronic version? So do you keep it in one personnel file? Okay, so it does look like a vast majority of you do file all of your employee documentation in one personnel file. And I'm glad you're on the call today. We're going to talk through that a little bit. Second polling question, right out of the gate, we're going to have polling question number 2. There we go. Do you allow supervisors or managers to access all of the information filed on employees who report directly to them? So they see everything that you have filed on an employee? Okay, so it does look like the majority of you have some sort of access parameters or rules with regards to who can see your personnel files, even for employees who report directly to them. So there is no, I wouldn't say there's a wrong answer necessarily. There's a better answer. And so we're going to talk about those things here today. So to start things off, there we go. Best practices with regards to filing your employee records are that you keep information separately based on who should be accessing it. And we're going to talk through each of these in detail, but basically there should be separate files for every single employee. Employee number 1, Amy Johnson. We'll say it's Amy Johnson's file. Amy Johnson should have a personnel file. She should have a benefits/medical file, and she should have a payroll/confidential file. They are 3 separate files that will contain specific information relative to Amy Johnson. There are also going to be some additional files that you will want to maintain in general. And one of those is recruitment files. So files that are specific to the positions that you are recruiting for, that contain all of the information related not only to the position, the approach you took to recruitment, but also all of the candidates who applied for that position and what their status is. There should be a separate file for your current employee Form I-9s, and another file for your terminated employee Form I-9s. And again, we're going to go into detail on what each of these will entail. Second thing we want to talk about is access. The reason that you're going to have separate files for an employee, personnel file, benefit, medical, and payroll confidential files, is because not every person in the company should have access to an employee's personnel files. So with the restricted access that you should have as a best practice is personnel files should be reviewed by the employee, and their supervisor can have access to that. Human resources, or whoever is maintaining those personnel records for you, can have access to everything related to an employee, whether it's the personnel file, benefit medical file, or the payroll confidential file. Employees should also be able to view all of their own records. So the records that you have in the personnel file, payroll confidential file, and benefit medical file. And then law enforcement, or the EEOC, will also have access to any and all records that you have on employees. Hopefully it doesn't get to a situation where you need to provide those records to those individuals, but you need to know that they do have the right to see anything that you are maintaining on an employee if they come to do any sort of investigation. Now, I want to make sure that you understand that It doesn't matter whether you have hard copy paper files or whether you have some sort of e-filing system or utilize an HRIS system, a human resource information system, to store the documentation on your employees. The same rules still apply. The nice thing about electronic files or HRIS system file storage is that you usually can set up security parameters so people can't get access to things they shouldn't have access to. When you have paper copies, it's a little more difficult. And so what we do recommend with that is that you keep all of your employee personnel files in one file cabinet that is locked. You keep all of their medical and benefit files in a different file cabinet that is locked, and you keep the payroll confidential files in a completely separate file cabinet that is locked. And the same applies for your Form I-9s and your recruitment information. So you have to have different areas where you can control some of the security with regards to who can access that information. Now I realize that this is really small font, and I know that Amy has forwarded the presentation to you, so you should be able to enhance it or zoom in on it in the format that you receive it. But we are going to go through the different types of files and what types of documentation you should find in those files. The first one is the personnel file. This is the one that the employee, HR, and their direct supervisor or those up the chain of command can have access to. This is going to contain information that's related to the employee and their job and their performance in their job, the progression of it, any type of company documentation that all employees have to complete, that will be found in the personnel file. So it starts off with their new hire information. This is usually the information that you gather from an employee during their orientation day or their onboarding process. So it could be the offer letter that states the start date for the employee, the position that they are joining your organization in, what their compensation is, maybe whether they're exempt or non-exempt, if they are eligible for overtime, if they qualify for benefits, those types of things. So an offer letter that contains just general information about the employee and their position when they join the organization, that would go into the personnel file. You can also put a copy of their resume, their transcripts, or any certifications that they may have submitted to demonstrate that they have the education to be qualified for the job. You may have an employee agreement, an employment agreement, a staff agreement, some sort of legal document that you provide to your new hires. If you do provide that, that would go in the personnel file, along with things like confidentiality agreements, non-disclosure agreements, non-compete agreements, if you're in states where those are enforceable. All of that would go into the personnel file. Any performance-related documentation would also go into the personnel file. So that would include performance evaluations, performance write-ups, performance improvement plans, kudos, anything related to performance that you are documenting. And I highly encourage you to document when you have performance issues so you can deal with them and have proof that you dealt with them. All of that will go into the personnel file. The types of compensation information that would go into a personnel file could be things like a pay change notification or a change in their FLSA status, which would be whether they're non-exempt or exempt, whether they're overtime or not eligible for overtime. That type of documentation could go into their personnel file. And then any bonus notifications. Compensation information also could go into the payroll file. Just make sure that you are consistently following a practice. This general file, it could go into a general personnel file, anything related to compensation. You also may put anything related to the job position. So if you have job descriptions that you have employees review and sign, that would go in here. Also promotion or demotion notifications or job change notifications if they're switching from one area to another area, one position to another position, if they're changing from full-time to part-time or part-time to full-time, that type of information could be filed in the personnel file. Any training or certifications that they might receive or achieve as they are employed with you, that would go in this personnel file. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, any acknowledgements. If you have an employee handbook, you should have an employee handbook acknowledgement form that every employee signs. That should go in the personnel file. And if you have any policy changes throughout the years from one revision of the handbook to the next, and you want to make sure employees are acknowledging they received those policy changes, then you would put those signed policy changes in the handbook or in the personnel file as well. And again, access to the personnel file, the employee, HR, their supervisor, or anyone in their chain of command, and then of course, governmental agencies like the EEOC or law enforcement. The benefit medical file, so a separate file for benefit medicals, would include any type of benefit enrollment information. So if you have paper copy enrollment forms, then that documentation would go in here. So that could be your medical, dental, vision enrollment forms or change forms. It could be life insurance enrollment forms and the COI that goes along with those if they're asking for an amount above a normal amount of coverage. Any changes to life insurance that they might have, or if you have accidental death and dismemberment insurance and an employee has an accident and now qualifies for some of that benefit, that type of documentation would go in here. You would put any flex spending, HSA, HRA type enrollment forms in here, and then anything related to retirement enrollment. So any benefits that you offer, if you have enrollment or change forms, or any type of automated system notifications of enrollments or changes, you will want to put that in your benefit medical file. If you have a separate benefit management system, everything is done online, you should be able to access that, so you won't need hard copy forms, but you just want to make sure that you have security parameters set up so that only the employee and whoever is administering HR have access to that. The medical side of the benefit medical file would include things like reasonable accommodation requests, medical leaves, doctor's notes, any medical certifications, those types of things. COVID-related documentation, if you have somebody who needs to be out for COVID and they're providing you with that proof that they do have it, a positive test, or at least an email saying that they tested positive, you'll want to put that in their benefit medical file. And any documentation referencing the health of the employee or the employee's family where the benefits might be involved. So anything that is related to benefits or medical related topics must be filed separately in a benefit medical file. And the reason for that is only the employee and the human resources person or whoever is handling HR should have access to that. Okay, employees have rights to privacy, and some employees don't want to tell individuals that they work with why they might be out on a leave of absence for 4 weeks. Okay, technically they don't have to. What the company would be concerned with is getting the medical certification, having HR take care of that, and then HR can notify the individuals within the department that this individual has qualified for a medical leave of absence. They will be out for this period of time, and here's when they will be returning. If the employee wants to share more information, that's fine, but when it comes to an employee records perspective, only human resources or the person handling that particular job responsibility and the employee should have access to this benefit medical file. The last general payroll file or general personnel file for employees would be the payroll confidential file. And in the payroll confidential file, you are going to find information related to payroll, such as their W-4, a direct deposit form, if you happen to have that. It also will contain any confidential information, such as legal documents. If someone gets married and they change their name, or they get divorced and need to remove individuals from benefit plans or from their emergency contact list. If there's any type of child custody documentation that's being provided because it might change withholdings from payroll. They may have some sort of government issued requirement to have funds taken out. It could be death certificates for an employee or a family member who has passed away, which then renders them eligible for some life insurance. Those death certificates can be filed in this payroll confidential file. Wage garnishments and anything related to criminal history or documentation related to criminal activity, time in jail, those types of things, that would all go in the payroll confidential file. You also may want to keep verification of employment requests and or your responses. You're not required to do that, but if you do retain verification of employment requests, so let's say a bank reaches out and says, Amy Johnson is applying for a car loan. Hey, ABC company, can you fill out this employment verification? You may want to fill it out and then retain that in the payroll confidential file in case Amy has a question as to what it is that you shared on her in that employment verification. You're not required to keep those. I just know that in a couple of circumstances for clients, that's kind of helped them out when an employee has come back and asked what information was shared. If an employee has any loan documentation, if you're a bank and employees get loans through you, that loan documentation should only be found in the payroll confidential file. If you have any sort of employee bank agreement, it should stay in this file because this file is not accessed by very many people. If you do background checks, you can keep the background check results in the payroll confidential file. And basically any documentation affecting employment decisions that don't really fit the personnel file or the benefit medical file. This payroll confidential file is truly designed to be one where an employee's very confidential information can be maintained. So an employee's social security number, if there are any forms that have social security number and birth date on them, that should be filed in the payroll confidential file. It's a nice way of keeping that information safe and secure because the only people that access this file would be the employee, human resources, and perhaps the people who handle payroll. They would have access to that W-4 and direct deposit, and then governmental agencies like the EEOC or law enforcement. There really is, the way that you need to think about it is, what does a supervisor or those up in the chain of command really need to know about the employee? There is nothing here that a supervisor or anybody higher up in the chain of command needs to know. They don't need to know a social security number. They don't need to know a birth date. They don't need to know if somebody has wage garnishments. They don't need to know the employee's bank information for their direct deposit. They don't need to know how many exemptions they might have. That has nothing to do with the employee performing their job. So that type of stuff needs to be kept confidential. And the same thing goes with their benefit and medical type of information. You don't need to know what benefits this employee is enrolled in and whether they have dependents on their plan. That doesn't affect their ability to do the job. So when it comes to maintaining these HR records, you want to make sure that you are only allowing the individuals who have a right to see it or who have a need to see the information to actually access it. All right, we are going to pop into polling question number 3. Have you conducted an audit of your personnel files, or have you been required to submit your personnel files for an audit? Have you been through this fun personnel file audit process before? Okay, so many of you have not. I'm actually glad to see that you're on this call then, because maybe you can do your own personnel file audit, and then if you are required to do one, you're better prepared for it. For those of you who have been through it, hopefully it was not a horrible experience for you. When I do personnel file audits for clients, I try to make it a positive experience, right? The goal is not to find out all the things you're doing wrong. That is not my goal when I do a personnel file audit. My goal is to help figure out what policies and processes do you say you have in place? What documentation do you say you collect on employees? And then let's go into your personnel files and see if we can find validation and confirmation that those processes are being followed and that those documents are being retained. So when you're preparing for this, there are a couple of things that you can do as an employer to position yourself in the best way possible to pass an audit. And so we're going to talk about what you can do there. So we have talked about these various files that you should have on an employee. So if you're going to do your own internal HR audit, the first thing you should do is to create those files for each one of your employees. So if you have 10 employees, all 10 of your employees are going to have a personnel file, they're going to have a benefit medical file, and they are going to have a payroll confidential file. And you're going to create those files, whether you do it in hard copy form or you create some sort of directory that only you have access to, and you would have, Amy Johnson as one file, and then she'd have folders within her file. So personnel file, benefit medical file, payroll confidential file. You want to make sure you set that up, because as you review each employee, this is the perfect time for you to get organized and to organize things in the best way possible. You also will want to make sure that you create a current employee Form I-9 file and a terminated employee Form I-9 file, and then take a look at the positions that you have recruited within the last year and create recruitment files for each one of those positions. First thing we're going to talk about right now, though, is those personnel files. So personnel, benefit medical, and payroll confidential. You're going to want to take a look at your current processes. Do you have a solid onboarding process? What types of things are shared in the onboarding process? What types of documents are you collecting at orientation? Do you have a performance management process? Do you do evaluations every 6 months, every 9 months, every year? How often are you doing them? Figure out what your timeline is for those. Do you have documentation that you fill out if somebody is going off the track and you need to do some performance improvement or performance coaching to get them back on the track? Do you have some standard forms that you would utilize for that? Do you have job change forms? Do you have benefit enrollment forms? Do you have a W-4? Do you have a direct deposit? Do you have an emergency contact list or form for them to fill out? What are all of your standard processes and the documentation associated with those processes? Create a spreadsheet, have all of those documents across the top, separated by, here's what I should put in the personnel file, here's what I should put in the benefit medical file, and here's what I should put in the payroll confidential file, and then list your employees along that first row or first column. Then as you go through each employee's file, their current personnel file, if they're all in one file, you're going to pull the documentation out. You're going to look across your list and say, you know what, Amy Johnson has an offer letter. Amy Johnson has a W-4. She has a direct deposit. She's got an employee handbook acknowledgement form. She has a confidentiality agreement. She enrolled in her benefits. So she has all of these things checked. But she's missing her emergency contact form that we have every employee fill out. So you would highlight that box for Amy Johnson. You would take your documents and you would put them appropriately in the personnel file. That would be the offer letter, the handbook acknowledgement. It would be the confidentiality agreement. In the benefit medical file, you would put all of her benefit enrollment forms. In the payroll confidential file, you would put her W-4 and her direct deposit. And now you have filed Amy Johnson's information properly, and you know what document she is missing. You then go on to the next employee, and you do this for all of your employees. Or maybe you pick 10 employees randomly to figure out, hey, where are my gaps? Because that is what an audit will show you. It will always show you that we say we have every employee fill out this confidentiality agreement, but I looked at 10 files and 7 of them were missing it. Why are they missing it? Did they start before we initiated the confidentiality agreement, or did we just not collect it? Or maybe it's not filed here, maybe it's filed somewhere else. It shouldn't be filed somewhere else. It should be in their personnel file. So it helps you to understand what processes may not be followed. It also could point out maybe a specific department that doesn't follow a process. It could be, you just might be able to see a whole host of things by going through your employee files, filing them properly, and seeing what documentation might be missing. When you have your spreadsheet showing you what's missing, you will then want to determine, how do we handle that, right? I'm missing the W-4 and the direct deposit on this employee, but they've been with us for 10 years, they've been getting paid. So do I really need to go back and have them fill out a W-4 and a direct deposit? Probably not. That's probably not something crucial. But they're missing their employee handbook acknowledgement. And I need to make sure that they have acknowledged they understand our policies, because if they violate a policy, I want to be able to refer back to that. Or maybe they didn't do a confidentiality agreement. And that's pretty important, because you want to make sure that they understand, hey, you got to keep things confidential. You can't be out there talking disparagingly about the organization. You can't share client lists. You can't share information with regards to who we work with and what it is that we do. You want to have some of those things in place. So some things are far more risky than other things. The less risky things you can let go, right? Like if you notice that somebody is missing, they haven't had a performance evaluation in a year and a half, it's a good thing to know. And you would want to let their supervisor know, hey, it's been a year and a half since they've had a performance evaluation. Could you please get that taken care of so that we're up to date? You can go back and there are some things, like I said, that are far more risky than other things. And you want to make sure you take care of those risky things, just to make the company, provide some safety for the company. Now, when it comes to collecting some of that missing information, that you have a few options, right? You're going to have some employees who are like, yeah, no problem. I'm going to sign my confidentiality. I'm going to sign my employee handbook. Here you go. You might have some other employees who kind of just don't really respond. And in those situations, you're going to want to meet with the employee and explain to them, hey, we just did this audit. We found that we're missing this document. We're missing the employee handbook acknowledgement. It's really important that you complete this, right? So here's the employee handbook. We'd like for you to review it and then sign the acknowledgement and turn it into us. You are acknowledging that we have provided you with the information with regards to the policies that we uphold here. We need for you to acknowledge that we gave you that, right? If they refuse to sign it, if you really don't care, it's pretty risky to not care, but if you just don't think it's that big a deal, then you can make a note that they refuse to sign it. Here's the date and they refuse to sign it. There are some types of things that might be missing from an employee file, though, that make it a condition of continued employment. You have to fill this out or you can no longer work here. It's too risky for us to have you in the position that you're in, not signing a confidentiality agreement. So sign it, or you're going to have to part ways, right? And there are a couple of documents that are pretty risky that you want to make sure they sign. There is one that they have to sign, and if they don't, you do have to terminate. It's the law, and that would be the Form I-9, which we will get to here soon. Employees cannot refuse to complete a Form I-9. If they do, you will be in big trouble if you continue to employ them. All right, polling question number 4. Do you retain the documentation that you gather during the recruitment process? We've been through the personnel files now. Now we're going to talk about recruitment files. So do you retain all the documentation that you gather during the recruitment process? Okay, oh, I'm really glad to see this. Retaining recruitment information is important for a whole host of reasons. Number one, if you don't pursue someone, you pursue one candidate, you don't pursue another, and the candidate you didn't pursue tries to sue you and say that you discriminated against them, not having any documentation at all to support the decision on why you pursued the other person can kind of get you into some legal trouble. And you may not have discriminated, right? You may have hired the person who was most qualified, but you have no proof of that by not having any documentation. And so maintaining that documentation can be pretty important from that perspective. But there are far more positive perspectives as to why you might want to retain that recruitment information, and we're going to get to that here shortly. So recruitment files as part of your employment documentation, your personnel file documentation, really is pretty simple. When you have a position, you've decided you need to hire a receptionist. You have a job description for that receptionist. That's one piece of documentation. Create a file, receptionist position, put the date that you're doing the recruitment. You then have the job description. Maybe you have an approval process you have to go through before you can open a position. Include that documentation. Maybe you have a list of different places where you post the position. Put that documentation in your recruitment folder. Perhaps you sit down and you come up with interview questions that you're going to ask of candidates to determine whether they are qualified to do the job and whether they would be a good fit for your organization. Have those standard interview questions as part of your recruitment file. Then as you start to get candidates, you're going to want to retain any information that these applicants and candidates provide to you. So if they submit a resume for a position, you're going to keep that resume. If they submit an application at any phase during your process, you're going to keep that application with their resume. If they interview, you're going to take notes during the interview using those standard interview questions that you created for the position. You're going to put those interview questions with their resume and their application. If you do any sort of background check or drug screening or any of that type of stuff, all of those results will go together with the information. Pretty much anything you gather on the candidate, you're going to put all of the information for that one candidate. So let's say Bob Smith applies for your receptionist position. You're going to have Bob's resume, his application, his interview questions, any additional notes or information that he may have provided or that you may have shared. All of that is going to go with Bob's record. And then you have Sandy Jones, who applies for position. The same one. She's not qualified though, and she submitted a resume, so she's not going to have an application. She's not going to have the drug screen. She's not going to have the interview notes. It's just going to be her resume. That's okay. You want to retain that. You want to retain all of the information on each candidate, and then you want to organize it by their status. So if you ended up hiring Bob, Bob's information would come up as this is our hired candidate. Okay. Sandy's information would come up as not qualified. If you have a process where you phone screen, then you might have several candidates in the phone screen process. So you'd have their resume, you may have their application, you would have their phone interview notes, and then you would put on there whether they were phone screen not selected. If they made it to an interview, then you would have their resume, their application, their phone screen notes, and their interview notes. And you would have on there that they interviewed, not selected, right? So you're keeping the candidate information together by person and then by status. And that will help you down the road when it comes time to either hire another person for that same position, or if one of those people applies for another job and you've already met with them, it could be that you can look back on that information and see why you didn't pursue them. Right? So it's important to keep all of the information together. If you are ever audited by the EEOC, or you, as part of your financial audit, they may ask to see some recruitment related records. You have everything all together. You can just turn it over. They can look through things and they can quickly determine, do you have a solid recruitment practice? Do you follow your practice consistently? And what type of information are you gathering on your candidates to make your decision? The types of information to retain, again, the resume, the application, the transcripts. If that person ends up being hired, you can take a copy of that information and put that in their personnel file as well. Always good to have that information in multiple places. Any phone screen or interview notes, any interview feedback forms where you've indicated, yes, I'm hiring them, or no, I'm not hiring them, and it's because they don't have enough experience, they don't have the education, not a good fit for our work environment, whatever the reasons are. All of those background checks or pre-employment testing that you might do. If you have any correspondence related to an offer, then you'll want to put that in there. And then if you are large enough and are collecting voluntary EEO information on your candidates, you want to make sure that you are retaining that information as well. That should never be in an employee's personnel file. You want to keep that separate. The EEO information and all of your testing results, including a background check, should only be accessed by HR. You need to make sure that you are putting people into that role that you trust. And if you are saying a drug test and a background check are required as part of employment with your organization, whether it's after somebody has accepted the offer or you do it at some other phase, most companies are now doing it after they've extended the offer. Then it's contingent on passing the background check or the drug screen. But those results should come to HR, and HR should be trusted to tell you, yes, they passed, or no, they did not. There is no reason for anyone outside of HR to know what part of something someone failed. You need to put people in that role that you can trust. And so if that's a concern for you, then whoever is handling your background checks and your pre-employment testing, make sure you're giving it to somebody who you can trust with that. All right. I thought it was really, really important to talk about recruitment records, because when you combine how you maintain your recruitment records, how you maintain your personnel files, how you maintain all of that employment and pre-employment related data can really have an impact on your business. And it helps with recruitment and retention efforts, which with unemployment as low as it is right now, it's super important to retain employees. So in looking at that, if you have strong compliant recruitment records, number one, you will have relevant information about each candidate for a position that you can utilize for future hires. Let's say you are hiring 2 production operators now, you get 47 candidates applying for a job. I'm trying to be positive here. Most companies are not seeing that many applicants, but let's say you get 47 applicants, you're only hiring 2. Let's say you interviewed 7 and 4 of them were really, really good. 4 of them were so good, but you can only hire 2. 2 months down the road, you need to hire again. You can go back to your recruitment records, look up the information for those other 2, reach out to them and say, hey, we just opened more positions. Would you be interested? It is a fast, efficient way to utilize data that you've already collected to assist you in that important recruitment process. The other thing you can do is, if you have these records that you are maintaining, let's say the candidate for the production position, they were a great person, but their skill set would be far better for something more clerical or administrative. And now we have you notice that we have a clerical position available. You can reach out to him and say, hey, we're not going to move forward on the production position, but we have this other position that we think you would be a great fit for based on your experience. Would you be interested? Again, creating efficiencies and utilizing the data that you are already collecting. Strong recruitment processes and documentation can turn all of the individuals who ever apply to your organization into a database or a pool of candidates for future consideration. And something to think about here is that those who may have applied for entry-level positions years ago now may have experience. So I'm thinking of, let's say you have a position available for a technician and you need somebody with 2 years of experience, and you get someone who applies who is fresh out of school. So they don't have the 2 years of experience. You can't move forward because you really need the 2 years of experience. So you don't pursue them, but you've maintained their data. You have their resume, you have their contact information, you have their educational information off of their resume. 2 years from now, they may have experience. They may have gotten a job as an entry-level technician and now have 2 years of experience. You have another job pop up that requires 2 years of experience. You can go back to that recruitment file or any database that you might create, and you can look at their information and say, okay, they applied back when they had just come out of college. I just looked them up on LinkedIn. They've been working at this one company for the last 2 years as a technician. They might be qualified for our job now. I'm just going to reach out to them and see if they have an interest in considering us for this experienced position. So it turns, again, you're collecting all this data anyway. Maintain it so that you can utilize it as a database to refer back to. And at least it would be a warm call instead of a cold call when it comes to recruitment. Strong compliant employment-related records can really help you out, because when it comes to performance management, if you are doing performance evaluations, if you are coaching when somebody is falling off the track and you want to get them back on track and you have documentation for that, it really allows you the opportunity to see, hey, how is this person developing? I noticed that we had to have a performance conversation with them. They got right back on track and now they are excelling, right? So they can take direction well. They are a good performer. Or you have performance evaluations that you're noticing people are getting exceptional marks, exceptional, exceptional, exceptional. Maybe they're ready for that next step, that promotion or a move into a new opportunity. Having that documentation there allows you to see a pattern. With regards to medical and benefit information, there is nothing more important than helping an employee when they are going through some sort of medical situation. And if you have all of your documentation put together and somebody needs to utilize that short-term disability benefit that you offer, it's far more efficient and things happen a lot more quickly if you're organized. So making sure that you have your information organized can help you out in efficiently and effectively enforcing the policies and practices that you already have in place for things like reasonable accommodation, leaves of absence, benefit coverage, and beneficiary details in case someone unfortunately has a situation that comes up and you need to reach out to whoever their beneficiary is. Payroll information being kept together can really show you maybe salary progression. It can show you how an individual is progressing in their career from a salary perspective, and what type of adjustments you may need to make based on that data. You may notice that somebody hasn't had a raise for 2 years, was never your intention. Somehow they slipped through the cracks. Maintaining efficient and effective records can help prevent that from happening. All right, we are now going to spend the next few minutes talking about the Form I-9. And the Form I-9 is the riskiest of all employment documentation. So I do want to spend some significant time here. I will tell you, I do a lot of Form I-9 audits, and 99% of the Form I-9s that companies have some sort of error that needs to be corrected. Some of them are simple errors, very simple to fix and move forward with. Some of them are not so simple, and those not so simple ones can cost an organization a lot of money. Technically, employees, new hires, must fill out their Form I-9 and provide their work authorization documentation to prove that they are eligible to work in the US within 72 hours of hire. So if you hire someone on a Monday, they have until close of business on Wednesday to get that documentation to you and to fill out the Form I-9. If they don't, then technically you are supposed to terminate their employment until they can provide that documentation. As an employer, you do not want to employ individuals who are not authorized to work in the United States. It will cost you a lot of money if you are caught doing that. So, first polling question on this section: do you have one person or a specific department who handles the completion of the Form I-9 for your new hires? Okay, good. I am glad to hear that you have one person, or most of you have one person or one department. Those of you who do not, I highly recommend that you assign a specific person, or maybe like a couple of people who can handle it. Have a backup. The more people you have involved in getting the I-9 completed, the more room for error there is, and inconsistent following of the process of completing an I-9. It's a 2-page document with a 72-page how to complete it guide from the government. So it is a very detailed document, even though it's 2 pages. So we're going to talk through this. Again, with the I-9s, you want to have current employee I-9s in one file and terminated employee I-9s in another file. Current employee Form I-9s, you will have page 1 and 2 of the I-9, and then you may want to include copies of the employee's work authorization documentation. It's not a requirement, but it is a best practice. And if you do accept documents for one employee, you have to do it for all. or I'm sorry, if you maintain them. So if you make copies of documentation for one employee, you have to make copies of documentation for all of your employees. And the reason it is a good practice is that in the event that there is some sort of question with regards to their Form I-9, if you have the documentation right there, a photocopy of the documentation that they provided, it is far easier to make corrections to the Form I-9. If you don't have a copy, you're going to have to ask the employee to resubmit the information or to provide you with the documentation so that you have it if there is an error on something or if something's missing. So best practice, page 1 and 2, and then copies of their work authorization documentation, all kept together. And if you're going to store this electronically, you would scan all of those documents as one document. So Amy Johnson, Form I-9, here's her documents. And then you put that in the current employee Form I-9 folder. Former employee Form I-9, you are required to retain former employee Form I-9s for 1 year from their date of termination or 3 years from their date of hire, whichever is later. So if you hired someone August 23rd of 2017 and they left your organization August 1st of 2021, you can get rid of their Form I-9. If you hired them January 1st of 2022 and they leave August 1st of 2022, you have to retain their Form I-9 3 years from when they started. So it would be January 1st of 2024. I'm sorry, 2025 is when you would be able to get rid of their Form I-9. It is really important that you get rid of that document just as soon as you can, because like I said, there are usually errors on Form I-9s that you will be fined for. So when it comes up to those terminated employees, those are the only documents that you can destroy. Make sure that you have a document destruction tracking sheet for your termed employees and that you're getting rid of those terminated employee I-9s as soon as you can. So 1 year from date of termination or 3 years from their date of hire, whichever is later. Former employee I-9s, again, you want to retain page 1 and 2 of the I-9, and if you have copies of their work authorization documentation, you want to keep those as well. Form I-9s can only be viewed by HR and the governmental agencies that will want to take a look at those, which it's ICE that wants to take a look at it. With the Form I-9, I think it's important that you understand some basics here. You want to make sure that you're utilizing the current version of the Form I-9. I-9s have expiration dates. However, usually those dates come and go. We are expecting a new version of the Form I-9 on October 30th, or actually on November 1st of 2022. So make sure that you have it marked down that you need to look and see if there is a new version. I always make sure that every time I have a new hire, I go out and just look for the current version of the Form I-9 because they're not gonna, they may make big announcements because there's supposed to be some significant changes to it coming up, but you wanna make sure you're using the current version. With new hires, to make sure that you can get that documentation that they are authorized to work in the US within that 72 hours of start, it's always a good idea if during onboarding, so those days leading up to their orientation day, that you reach out to them and let them know, hey, as part of orientation, you're going to complete a Form I-9. We're going to need for you to take a look at page 3 of the attached Form I-9, which lists all of the acceptable documents for you to prove that you have the authorization to work in the US. Okay, you cannot tell an employee or a new hire what forms to bring. You can't even make a recommendation. You can't say, oh, just bring your passport or bring your driver's license and a social security card, because you could be discriminating against somebody who doesn't have that type of documentation. So you can give them page 3, which is a list of acceptable documentation, at least in the current version it is. When you are completing it, make sure that whoever is authorized to do this on behalf of your organization sits down with the employee and goes through every single line on page 1. They have to complete other last names used. They have to complete middle initial. They have to complete apartment number, email. If they don't have any of those things, if they don't have a middle initial, another last name, an apartment number, or an email, they have to put NA in the box. It is a fine if they don't complete every single section. You want to make sure that that person for your organization goes through the first page, looks at that section, makes sure that in the next section that they've checked what their authorization is, whether they're a citizen of the US, they're here on a work visa, they have an alien work visa card, whatever their status is, they have to check one of those boxes. They have to sign and date it. And then last but not least, down at the bottom, there's a section for preparer and or translator, and it asks a question. Did you use a preparer and or a translator? If they did not, they will check the no, I did not use a preparer or translator. If they did, they will check the yes box, and then whoever assisted them with filling out page 1 has to fill out that bottom section. The things that are missed the most: middle initial used, apartment number, other last names used, that gets missed. People oftentimes will put their birth date instead of the date that they're signing the document, and they will miss checking that preparer and or translator. So make sure somebody is going through and looking at those things. The employer completes page 2. You want to make sure you complete line 1 of page 2 up at the top, where you have to put the employee's last name, first name, middle initial, and what their work authorization status is. And then you verify the documentation that they bring, put it in the right spots in either list A or in list B and list C. And then you sign and date and complete that page 2 section. It is so important that you do not make copies of more documentation than you need to. If somebody brings a passport, a driver's license, and a birth certificate, you do not make copies of all 3 documents. That is called over-verifying, and it is a really big penalty because it's saying that you're discriminating against somebody and requiring them to provide more work authorization documentation than is necessary. So in those circumstances, pick either the list A item or a list B and a list C item and record those. That is one of the biggest things that we see from an employer perspective, is that people are over documenting, and that carries a heftier fine than one would imagine. To correct Form I-9, so if you've had employees complete them, you know that some of them are wrong based on what I've just said, it's easy to correct. You can go back through your I-9s, you can cross through incorrect information, write the correct information, initial, and date it with the date that you're making the correction, okay? You then will want to make sure that section 1 corrections are only made by the employee. I'm sorry, page 1. You have to make sure that page 1 is only filled out by the employee. Page 2, which has section 2 and section 3, that is completed and corrected by the employer. If you have an I-9 that has so many corrections that are needed that it would be a hot mess, you can issue a new Form I-9, have the employee fill out the new one, employer fills out a new page 2, but you have to attach the original I-9 to the new I-9. You cannot just get rid of the old one. Anytime you make corrections, you're going to want to make sure you have some sort of memo that you can attach and attach it to the I-9 so that if you are being audited, they understand why there are corrections. And it can be something as simple as, we conducted our own internal audit. We have found errors, and either the error was corrected, or here's the reason why it was not corrected, and we did something different. Like maybe they couldn't provide their passport. They had originally provided a passport. We couldn't confirm the numbers on it. So this time around, they provided us with a driver's license and a social security card. You'll want to document that and just have that attached to the corrected I-9. In the end, conducting an audit of your own records can help you identify gaps or inconsistencies with your policies, your practices, your standard documentation. Correcting those inconsistent practices can help mitigate risk with regards to employment laws. And having those consistent practices in place will provide an opportunity for business leaders to kind of do what they're really interested in doing, which is moving the company forward, which makes it far more attractive for recruiting and retaining potential employees.